Hi, Deb.
Hi.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. How do I introduce you? Should I say, how do I say your first name?
Just say Deb.
Deb. Okay, perfect. We usually end up starting by around 10:05. So because we give people 5 minutes to settle in, and then do you have a particular length of talk that you've structured? Because we like to keep some questions in the end.
I planned for 45 minutes. So
Okay.
yeah, we'll have 15 minutes or so.
Okay, perfect. Yes. 45 minutes is perfect, because we do end up getting a lot of questions, and I think we can filter through if there are too many, but yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, I can't seem to be able to start my video. I can do that later. The other thing I need to do is, of course, share my screen to be able
Yes.
to.
Do you want to try that before?
Yeah, let me try that. So can you see that?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, good. So stop sharing for now or keep it there?
Yeah, I mean, you can just share the title slide. I think that'll be
okay.
nice.
Yeah. Cool. So we'll probably wait for 10 minutes or so before we start.
I'll be introducing you, and then we can get started.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yes.
Okay, I can kick us off now. Thank you so much for joining this morning if you're on the West Coast, and evening if you're in Asia. And this is the third talk in our SGS Global Seminar Series. And today we're going to be talking about the future of coal in terms of retiring and repurposing coal plants. I'll briefly introduce Deb from the World Bank, and then we can get started. So Deb leads the Power System Planning Group at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And he was a director with Deloitte, Australia, and the principal of Charles River Associates, Asia Pacific, before joining the World Bank. And Deb now holds the adjunct professor appointments at the University of Melbourne and University of Queensland in Australia. Thank you so much for joining us, Deb, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Dhruv, and welcome everyone. So we have limited time, so I'll just launch into this particular slide deck, and I'll probably take about 45 minutes to go through it. So to start with, I think, we have an accelerating coal transition program. So I'm going to really summarize our experience with this program over the last 2 years or so. So the typical retirement option for coal plants has been and still is to sell the scrap, net of demolition cost at about 50K per megawatt. And the other option of actually building a bigger new unit that's disappearing quite rapidly, even in countries like India and South Africa, which is kind of our two main target countries at the moment. We have started working in Vietnam as well, but it's still very, very early stage. Now, if we don't actually build a new plant, the other alternative that we are looking into very seriously is repurpose the site, especially if it's a critical location for power system security. And if it is not one of those sites like near a big city like Badarpur in Delhi, where the real estate value is very high. And there are some important social aspects. Like in Vietnam, we have a very old plant, only 100 megawatt, but there are 400 employees in that plant. So we need to look into the social program very seriously. So I'll actually cover 3 aspects today associated with repurposing. What is the technology mix and what drives the economics of such a project, and touch upon briefly on the available business models, of which repurposing is just one of them. So I think the basic idea is that we'll sort of create a renewable and flexibility center. That's the main model that we are targeting at the moment. So let's get into the technology mix issue from that perspective. So our preliminary project design so far at the bank has been around, like the combination of PV and then, and it can be sort of ground mount PV as well as floating PV, battery storage and Syncon. And then I'll talk about, like the other technology options in a couple of minutes, but they may include like wind and gas, both of which are part of consideration in South Africa, biomass, thermal storage, and so on. In terms of the solar PV, the basic idea has been to build them on abundant ash ponds. Then we can also have quite a bit of floating solar in some cases, the sort of reservoir, if there is one. And in Madhya Pradesh, in central India, for example, we have a pretty good case where we have a very large reservoir that can hold up to 500 megawatt of floating solar. And then once we sort of clear the space occupied by cooling towers, boilers, electrostatic precipitators, then there are sort of rooftops, vacant areas. So a typical coal plant site can, on average, accommodate around 100 megawatt of solar. And then we have range between sort of 50 megawatt in very small plants to up to 250 megawatt And as I mentioned, in central India, we may be able to do up to 500 megawatt if we actually get permission to do the floating solar on the reservoir. In terms of battery storage, the turbine generator house itself can actually hold some batteries, maybe around 100 megawatt hour or so. And then, like there could be actually plenty of sort of space within a typical power plant site where we can locate it close to the substation. And we actually, I'm just coming back after a 3-week tour of India, and then of the 6 plants that we visited, we found actually plenty of space for battery storage in all of those locations. And the beauty of that project is that, it will be all transmission ready, and hence the cost of these battery storage projects will be at least 20% lower from our preliminary estimates. And then if we can also use the existing generator to be repurposed to synchronous condenser, it will basically be energized through grid power and operate in a synchronous condenser mode. And it can actually provide maybe 150 to 300 megawatt reactive power, dynamic reactive power very easily and very cheaply. So this is sort of one of the typical layouts. So this is one of our initial tasks to identify what parts of the plant should be retained, and the bits that you see in green, mainly the sort of switchyard, the high voltage switchyard that will be retained. And then the red bits are where the PV can go in, and it could be existing plant site, or it could be the ash pond and so on. The purple color areas are the proposed battery expansion. So this is just one of the possible sort of layouts. It will of course differ from plant to plant. And this is just a photo to show you that there is usually lots of space near the switchyard where battery storage can go in. So this is from the Kolaghat plant in West Bengal. And in terms of synchronous condenser, the major advantage is that if we can use the sort of current stator rotor, and if it is in reasonable condition, then it can be done at a fraction of cost of a new dynamic reactive power device. So it could cost, for example, only $15 to $20 kilowatt compared to at least 100 per kilowatt for a new SynCon or a StatCom or a static bar compensator. So that's the advantage. And this is just actually a picture of a 60-year-old generator, actually still in pretty good condition. It can be repurposed to SynCon. And the other important thing is that the requirement for SynCon will of course depend on what the system needs in terms of dynamic reactive power. So we are actually doing sort of load flow studies and stability studies to assess how much reactive power is needed. And usually these plants have been a good source of reactive power for many, many years. And by and large, the hypothesis is that some amount of reactive power compensation will be needed. So if a plant had 6 units, it's unlikely that all 6 of them will need to be converted, but 1 or 2 will most likely be needed. And the compensation for reactive power is an important element. So we are actually working with the regulator in both countries, India and South Africa, to make sure that the reactive power pricing is actually in place. And by the end of this month, hopefully CERC in India will issue that directive. The exact price and all those things are still confidential, so I can't reveal it, but it's going to be in the range of $2 to $5 per megawatt hour. Now, very quickly, in terms of the other technology options, there are quite a few. So biomass co-firing came up in both countries, and also it has been used in some of the other countries. It's a possibility, but keeping coal alive with co-firing is not something we can pursue as part of a bank project, because that sort of extends the life of coal in a way. Thermal storage, which has been tried in Chile, it's an option, but it's a rather specific option in countries where the the requirement for base load is very distinct. And so if we can't do something with sort of 3 or 4 hours storage, which is usually doable through pump storage or battery storage, then that's a definite option. The economics otherwise does not sort of work out very well. Wind is very land intensive and location specific. It's actually under consideration in South Africa, but it's going to be sort of our second phase of the project that will consider it. Green hydrogen, modular nuclear reactor, they have been discussed in both countries, but they are also sort of somewhat futuristic options at the moment. Let me talk a little bit about the economics of these projects, and just in terms of cost, the cost sort of varies quite a bit for these repurposing projects, and they're mainly associated with the new investments. A typical project we are looking at is sort of $200 to $250 million, but in South Africa, for example, the very first project will probably be bigger than that. So it depends. We may also have the odd plant in India, which will be even below sort of $100 million in one case. And these are all sort of preliminary numbers, but the components of that cost is starting with planning design, but the new investment is kind of that covers the bulk of that cost. And I've given some indicative number of what a project might look like: 100 megawatt solar, 300 megawatt of battery, 150 megawatt of Syncon, some upgrades to the switchyard and connections. So that's the main core component of that cost. And then there will be other costs associated with site remediation, project management, and so on. As I mentioned, it can be significantly higher depending upon how much land there is, which varies a great deal from power plant to power plant. And let me sort of lay out the framework for economics, which has been a fairly contentious issue for us. So first of all, we need to define what will be the counterfactuals. So if we look at the possibilities, there are 4 possibilities: that the plant is decommissioned immediately. Then the second option is that the plant can actually continue for a few more years. And that's kind of our most likely scenario. That's our main counterfactual. Plant is repurposed for energy purpose, which is the third option. That's basically our project. And the plant is repurposed for non-energy, which is kind of somewhat outside the scope of our project. So the economic benefit is assessed by comparing 2 with 3. And we can also run a stress test, which is basically 3 versus our project versus option 1, where the plant is decommissioned immediately. And the main difference between 1 and 2 is that we don't get to actually count any carbon benefit. And I'll show you that that's kind of like the main issue for us. Now, the definition of the project, the concept 1, I just put it in the slide, but I've already covered that this will be a combination of PV, battery storage, and Syncon for our initial projects. So I'll skip that. The second concept is like the time dimension of the project. So as I said, the second sort of counterfactual I discussed before, that basically assumes that the core plant will continue for a few years before being decommissioned. And this needs to be established through a residual life analysis, the RLA study. And that's what's being sort of mandated as part of our own projects, that the RLA study will need to be done to show that even if the plant is not being used fully at the moment, then that it could actually have a residual life extension that needs to be demonstrated. So that's the sort of black line that's showing that the plant will continue if we don't repurpose now. And the green line shows that we'll basically repurpose it now. So the coal plant disappears and the repurposed project can actually continue, typically say for 30 years. Now, in terms of incremental costs and incremental benefits, so that's our kind of economic framework to compare both costs and benefits in incremental terms. incremental over sort of the counterfactual. So on the cost side, that I already described, that there will be the decommissioning costs, there will be some social costs because some jobs will be lost because the plant is retired earlier than expected. The capex is the main component of the cost, and that could include PV, storage, and Syncon, and there may be some incremental generation cost, but then that component is going to be very small, probably negligible, and pretty difficult to estimate. So we kind of like try to keep it outside the equation. On the benefit side, the biggest two components of benefits will be the environmental benefit of avoided CO2, and that will be relevant only for the part up to the red line. So basically, for the part the plant will continue absent the repurposing project, and the ancillary services benefits. So if we do include battery storage as well as Syncon, those will provide significant amount of frequency control and voltage control services, and those benefits can be a significant component, although they will be typically lower than the avoided cost of CO2. So let me go through very quickly an example. So a typical 500 megawatt unit or a plant with 300 employees, that's typical of these countries, roughly 0.6% per megawatt. That's the average. And so if I actually, let me not spend too much time going through this long text, but basically, if you look at the third bullet point, bottom, the last line, if we take the solar battery storage and Syncon for a typical project, it sort of adds up to about $142 million. That's a typical sort of investment that we are talking about. The social costs of lost jobs and then the compensation that will be paid, that could add another sort of $20 million. And then if I add the decommissioning cost, I get to a total incremental cost of $182 million. On the benefit side, the CO2 cost, even if we take a very conservative number of $10 per ton, over a sort of a 5-year avoided emissions benefit will work out to be $210 million. So that number alone typically should exceed the cost, incremental cost of the project. And the break-even price in this case works out to be $6.4 per ton. Now, they're like ifs and buts, and why 5 years, and how do we establish that? So we do need a RLA study to prove that the plant would have continued if we did not do the repurposing project, etc. Why $10 per ton? And then in fact, our sort of bank guideline starts with $30 per ton. So this part of the benefit can be significant and should actually cover the cost quite comfortably. Then the ancillary services will, of course, depend on the ancillary services prices and whether there is a pricing scheme in place. For spinning reserve, typically there is a price. So in South Africa and India, both there is a price. And as I mentioned, the reactive power was a bit of a question mark. So we are sort of in the process of resolving that. But like based on the sort of guideline numbers that we have in this particular case, it will be around $111 million over a 10-year period. And again, like the timeline for which we can claim these benefits, etc., those will need to be established very carefully. But this is purely an illustrative example here. But what you can see is that if we don't have the CO2 benefits, then $111 million is less than the cost of the incremental cost of the project. And that's kind of like what I meant by the stress test. So if we don't actually have a early retirement, then the economics doesn't work out in this case. Then we have the social benefits that some of the jobs of the plant will actually be saved because the substation, possibly the generator, will be there. So some of the existing employees can continue their current work, and with the addition of PV and storage, there will be sort of new jobs created, and the like part of the existing workforce can be retrained to operate those facilities. So that's kind of like roughly our rough estimate or guideline rule of thumbs, whatever you want to call it, is that 20% of the jobs can be saved through a repurposing project. So in this case, it's slightly lower than that, 50 jobs. That particular social benefit also adds a little bit to the benefit, but not much. So the key point on the economic analysis is that we need to be very clear on the timeline of this project, and early retirement needs to be established very carefully. Otherwise, the rest of the economics may or may not justify the cost. Now, sort of the last topic that I'll cover very briefly is on business models. And let me actually list firstly the 5 options. So, like we kind of jumped into the repurposing option, but there are, of course, other ways to retire coal. And this is kind of the 5 typology or classes that we are trying to come up with. This is basically from a paper we are in the process of writing. So this is pretty premature in that sense. But the way we have categorized it so far is that we are talking about policy-based closure and natural market-led attrition. So basically, you don't do anything to directly go and close down coal, but it happens through direct or indirect policies or through wholesale markets. Then the second option is the buyout, which is kind of one of the popular models that's being discussed a lot. Then we talked about repurposing, which is neither of the previous 2 options, but it's a kind of a standalone option, or it could be combined with one of these other options where we go and do early retirement and repurpose the site. If it is an investor-owned utility, then we also have an option to do coal to RE swap, and that's also happening somewhat naturally in a lot of the utilities, including the National Thermal Power Corporation, which is now called NTPC Limited. They are doing plenty of RE, and the possibility of doing a swap between coal and RE is an option. And the hybrid option, I've thrown it in there because all of these options can be combined in some shape or form with other options. So I have a few slides, and I don't plan to actually go through it in any great detail on each of these options. What are the pros and cons? And I'll just pluck out the significant points before concluding this talk. So firstly, the policy-based closure. This is predominantly an age-based retirement, and it could be market-driven. And this is kind of like what UK has done. I mean, they have done some climate-focused policies starting 2017, but their coal plants have been sort of retiring because of old age, because of competition from gas, and through the formation of wholesale market since the 90s. So, and this is now happening actually at a decent pace in US. Some of the coal plants are just not economic, so they're dying naturally. And that's one way of doing it. The advantage, of course, is that it's a fairly natural attrition process. On the disadvantage or the con side is that it can be a very slow process. So it has taken like good 25 years for very old coal plants to die in the UK, and it's the process that's just beginning to happen in India, but very, very slowly. In terms of the buyout model, so that's what we call direct action in Australia some years ago. So it's a very targeted purchase and shutdown of coal plants. This is essentially where Asian Development Bank has come up with the ETM, I think it's called Energy Transition Model. That's the mainstay of that particular proposition, that you go out and buy a bunch of plants and retire them. So the advantage is that it can be a pretty rapid retirement if we can do it successfully, if we can attach a financing model to it and generate all the money needed to buy out those plants. On the con side, I guess, like it's not entirely clear actually where you can find that much money, because concessional financing that's available through schemes like accelerating coal transition model that we are doing is very limited compared to the number of gigawatts that need to be retired even within the developing world. So, and then there are like other questions on, like how do you deal with the flexibility part? If you try shutting down a lot of coal plants rapidly, which Australia did in at least in South Australia state, and then that led to a few great failures because there was not enough flexibility in the system to deal with variability of wind there. And then the buyout model also didn't actually work in general in Australia because the compensation that the plant owners were claiming was just too high compared to the funds available. So that's kind of the buyout. The repurposing, we already talked about. The good part of it is that it's versatile, it's scalable. The ownership doesn't need to change. And the cost benefit, if it works out, which will be very case specific, then then it clearly has an economic case. So it's a standalone sort of business model in that sense. But then on the downside, it's sort of something what we are experiencing, that it needs very case specific consideration. Each project needs to be designed, and each project can be very different in terms of their design and implementation requirements, and so on. And then the other part is that the compensation for ancillary services, it's not there in every country. So that also needs to be carefully developed. And we have limited experience so far. So unlike the policy-based closure, where there's a lot of clarity what works, what doesn't work, is not the case with repurposing yet. In terms of RE swaps, this is going to be a rather specific model, and I think the investor-owned utilities, it's pretty clear to me that it may be a very good option. We are in the process of initiating some discussion with one of the states in India to do such a swap, and if we can achieve that and make that state the first green state in India, that will be wonderful. But this is really very, very early stage of that sort of dialogue, and we kind of don't know its sort of full potential. So that's why it's a relatively untested proposition at this stage. And let me jump to the very last slide, which is kind of like the hybrid idea. And this is still, in our sort of thinking stage, how can we combine the other four models and then sort of find a flexible and adaptable mechanism to fit multiple contexts. So, for example, it's possible for someone to do a buyout model, basically ADB's ETM model, in conjunction with repurposing. There's nothing, conceptually stopping us from doing or thinking about such a model. You can initiate sort of market-based mechanism, which we are also exploring in both India and South Africa, where we can actually go in and say that we will do sort of a CFD mechanism to convert the coal-based PPAs. And in that sense, it sort of unlocks the obligation for the distribution companies to buy coal-based power. But then we'll also do sort of repurposing. So in that sense, it could be a combination of option one, sort of policy and market-based mechanism together with repurposing. In any case, there is a move in India to move to a gross pool or a market-based economic dispatch, as they call it, MBED. And that will also be a pretty good way to bring competition between renewables and coal in that market. Probably starting with a segment of thermal as early as next year. So if we can sort of combine these options, so that's a genuine possibility as well. And then my personal view is that, although we have created this typology to put them in different boxes, in reality, many of them will get naturally combined to form good sort of hybrid options. So that's kind of what I plan to cover today, and sort of I'll leave plenty of room for discussion. So what I might do is maybe stop here, take some questions, and then continue the discussion based on that. Thank you.
That sounds good. Thank you so much for this, Dave. We have 4 questions in the chat. I think you can also pull them up. So maybe we can go one by one. The first one is that for newly commissioned coal plants, what's the best way to retire plants without negatively impacting the economics or the return on investment? And the second part to this is, what are the barriers to coal renewable energy switching in developing markets?
Okay, so yeah, I might start with the first part, which is the most difficult segment. And I think, for newly commissioned coal plants, to be honest, the bank projects are deliberately not getting into the most difficult and the deepest end of the problem. But if I were to sort of hypothetically think about that, then it will have to be a very special case to look at, say, 10 or 15-year-old coal plant, of which we have plenty in East Asia. Then it has to be sort of a merit-based case. So if somebody has sort of invested in a bad coal plant with a very high PPA, and we have PPAs of $80 or $85 per megawatt hour, then, and if they're not getting dispatched anyway sufficiently, then you could sort of go and make a case that why don't you sort of repurpose and find substantial amount of probably storage, which could be the new business for the plant. So I would sort of argue in favor of a repurposing option with plenty of storage to still use a lot of the existing facility. And in China, we have actually such a case where we are in early stage of discussing that, because they have literally brand new plants and also some plants under construction, where we are trying to make a case that if they could actually make some of those plants available, then concessional financing could be a way to support the coal transition. Because those plants, there are relatively new plants in China that are already operating for less than 2,000 hours a year. So that's more like 20% utilization, clearly uneconomic. So in the newly commissioned coal plants, it has to be a very, very special case for us to try whether repurposing could be the model. Then the second question, what are the barriers to coal to RE switching in developing markets? Why it's not happening fast enough? I think the principal problem, at least in the countries that I have personally looked at, is the contracts. So if the PPAs are still out there for another 20 years, and in India, actually, we don't realize sometime that, the last decade, coal capacity has doubled from around 100 gigawatt to 200 plus gigawatt. And we have added around the same amount of renewable over that time period. So you seem to think that India is doing only renewables. It's not the case. And these contracts will continue for another 25, 30 years. So that's why if we can find a way to do a bit of market orientation of these contracts, that's the only way we can actually add another 200 or 300 gigawatt renewables in India. Otherwise, there is no room. So that's kind of the biggest barrier as I see it. I mean, there are other issues. The market, the wholesale market, although it has been in operation for 12 years, it actually doesn't let RE participate in the market. So we firstly need to take care of the PPAs on coal. And this is generally the case in all the markets. Then secondly, we need to find a way to create a wholesale market that allows RE to participate freely. So those are the two big barriers in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The next question is also very interesting, that Africa and India are seeing the emergence of integrated utilities that work with private discoms. For example, Tata Power in Odisha in India. And does the model for coal transition change in such a setting? And I think this makes a lot of sense, because in Africa, you have public-private partnerships like Connexa. In India, you see Tata Power. So how does coal transition play out in such settings?
The coal transition, I think, like when you're working with ESCOM, for example, in South Africa, and yeah, I mean, it's the coal transition. I personally don't think it's kind of like all that dependent on the structure of the industry. If we have a coal plant that's not clearly economic, and it, we can actually find a number way of retiring the plant, regardless of the ownership or regardless of the structure. So, and like when all the projects that we are trying to pursue in India at the moment, they are all with the state-owned utilities that are, like, I mean, like, I mean, they don't have anything particularly special for us to actually go and try to shut down the plants before they are due for retirement. So I don't know. I mean, in terms of this particular question, I don't think the model for coal transition needs to change significantly. The only exception would be if we are trying to do a coal to RE swap. Then if we have a sort of investor-owned utility, it makes it a lot easier to implement that. But otherwise, repurposing, I can think of all possible sort of models where it will actually work quite easily.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. The next question is that coal plants often function as peaker plants, especially in geographies with a high penetration of renewables. And for regions like this, is coal RE switching viable?
Yeah, good question. I think, and this is probably a trend that will get only stronger, which is happening in parts of China and also in parts of India at the moment. These are the two big coal countries in the developing world. And then the coal to RE switching to happen, this is kind of like the biggest challenge, which is why we are insisting on these RE plus flex centers. Because what will happen is that if we need to manage variability and the coal plant needs to be either working as a peaker for, say, 5 days a week, or for some seasons like the summer season in India, then we have a huge problem managing variability when the coal plant is not there. Because a lot of the sort of inertia, a lot of the frequency and voltage control services will disappear. So we probably need massive amount of flexibility to be created through storage, through syncons, and other options like pump storage and so on. Because otherwise, this is not going to work very well in terms of power system security. And that's one of the attractions of the repurposing model, that if we can turn the existing coal plant site itself as a flexibility center, then it works very well. So one of the models that we are exploring, for example, is that let's say you take a coal plant and you retain 2 out of 6 units, and those 2 units can operate as a peaker, as the suggestion sort of offers, and the remaining 4 units can convert into synchronous condenser with flywheel. So you don't have coal anymore, but all of the other services are very much there. So that could be a way to actually achieve this particular end.
Thank you for that. We have another question about, so the question is that China has very high levels of coal, so does India. And how do we achieve coal swaps at such a large scale? I think it's at the country level. Is there a long-term economically viable alternative that can accelerate retirement?
Yes, yeah, no, excellent question. And I think, yeah, China does have a terawatt of coal. India has 200 gigawatt of coal. So between them, we actually have 60% of the total coal capacity in the world. And then both countries are aiming for very, very high renewable penetration. So I mean, I just actually reviewed some of the results from China. So they're planning for something up like 6 terawatts of renewables in another 30 years. So it's massive amount by 2050. And the acceleration is also massive. So they'll get rid of close to a terawatt of coal to be replaced with 6 terawatt of renewables. India, for example, also has like a 500 gigawatt renewable target by 2030. So that's also massive, although not all 200 gigawatt of coal will be retired. So that's the plan. So the policies are in place to aspire for that. Whether it's an economically viable option or not, that's a very, very interesting question, because the investment requirement itself is prohibitively large in both countries. And more importantly, if the coal contracts are not taken care of very soon, at least in India, I don't see actually how renewables can actually even enter and have a business. And how coal can actually have a business either at sort of 30%, 40% plant load factor. So I think the policy and the reality, there is a bit of a mismatch at present. But if we start sort of breaking down the power purchase agreement and sort of link them to market, that's the very first task that we have to do. And in terms of physical investment and the power system security, a lot of flexibility centers is a must. I think if those two preconditions are met, then at least we can be on the runway and start running. Whether it will actually pick up and whether we'll actually get the height, it still remains to be seen. But the policy is there. The preconditions are kind of becoming very clear. Whether they will be actioned on or not remains to be seen. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. We have two more questions. So the first one is that if we repurpose coal plants while retaining a few units, how does this impact the emissions intensity? And peaker plants have a higher emissions intensity as opposed to other operating units. And should these dirtier units be taxed differently?
Yeah, good question. I don't think it's an ideal scenario where we retire only some of the units. But in India, China, to some extent South Africa as well, the reality is that we talk about a plant, but the units actually have often very different vintage. So we don't really have much choice other than targeting the older units first, retire them, and actually balance the load with the remaining sort of newer units so that they have a more stable operation. So rather than actually having a 1,000 megawatt coal plant, let's say there are 5 units at 40% PLF, if we retire a couple of units and repurpose them and actually let the other 3 units actually have a more decent PLF plant load factor of say 60%, that's better. And then, yeah, as for the sort of peaker plant with higher emission factor, that needs to be seen, because I think one of the basic challenges that we have is that there is no sort of reliable emission measurement in place, at least in China or India at the moment. So the higher emission intensity, that needs to be checked first, because if the plant is being dispatched sensibly, it need not necessarily increase emission intensity. But if they are, that's also a possibility. Then whether they should be taxed differently, that's an interesting proposition. I think the emissions, the carbon tax is kind of non-existent in a lot of the countries that we work in. So the policy first needs to be in place before we get into nuances like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. The next question is that for developing economies in sub-Saharan Africa, how can we deploy investment capital to repurpose plants?
Yeah, that's something that we are actually debating quite vigorously within the bank. Is it worth actually trying to decarbonize these very small countries where there are like fewer plants, or whether the focus should be on big places like India and South Africa with substantial coal fleet, and then with accelerating coal transition program country selection, we went through like quite a bit of debate on that. But in terms of the actual question, how can you deploy investment capital to repurpose plants? I mean, this is where, if we have a serious case, this is where the concessional financing will be quite a key. And we do have some of those countries, not so much in sub-Saharan Africa, where we argue that, in places like Morocco, who are showing very good intention to actually decarbonize, and then they are still quite a bit reliant on coal. There could be a case for concessional financing. It's still work in progress, but I think without concessional financing, those cases will not fly at all.
Can you, I mean, you mentioned this where you've had a debate of small countries with fewer plants versus larger economies. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think the debate was, we have a coal transition program which has got concession financing of about $2.5 billion. And, in terms of management of such a program, if we try to target something like 20 countries and fail miserably versus try 3 or 4 big ones where we can focus and actually do lots of plants in a single country like India. So that's where the debate was. It was mostly around, doing things well in a couple of countries where it has got a very significant fleet with, lots of old coal plants that are sort of the proverbial low-hanging fruit, versus trying to do 1 or 2 plants in lots of different places. So basically, in other words, the question is, where should the concessional financing primarily go? And the decision in the end, I guess, with the selection that we have is in the former category of target India, Indonesia, South Africa, etc., rather than worry about 1 or 2 plants in Latin America or Morocco and so on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess the last question, and it's nice to end on this generalistic note, is that with the crisis in Europe or the European Union, there's an emergence of coal plant operations. And we've seen this directly with Germany and Italy and some other countries either ramping up coal production or trying to revive plants that were previously retired. And in general, what does this mean for the future of renewables?
Yeah, no, this is very, very sad news for us. And actually, one of the prominent countries for repurposing on our program was also Ukraine. It has got a very old fleet of coal, and we were also financing the HVDC interconnection with Europe, which kind of helped in the very short term. But then, I think it sort of puts a huge spanner in the program that we have, and it's also something we are discussing quite intensively. Like, what does it mean for renewable? Exactly the question that you have here. So I think it does sort of put quite a high emphasis on the future of the importance of energy security for these countries, because I think it's kind of it's also making our regional integration task a lot more difficult. People are worrying, if we get dependent on another country and if the relationship goes bad, then what does it mean? So it's a huge issue for us in Central Asia, It's also an issue for us in South Asia at the moment. So I don't know. I think it's kind of like suddenly puts the energy security issue back on the table, and hence the regional integration, and hence the ability to do really large scale renewable in one country to help other countries. It can actually go seriously out of the window for a while. So I think, like personally, and I won't speak on behalf of bank on this, I personally think that this is going to be a transitory effect, but it will be a very strong effect to dislodge our effort for at least good 1 or 2 years. What happens beyond that remains to be seen. But it's a very tough one to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for ending on that note. I do feel that we've had a really interesting discussion on coal plant retirement, and as you mentioned, it's all the more important in this context where we're seeing the emergence of coal plants. So thank you so much for sharing your views and your opinion and the bank's progress in this area. And to all of the attendees, I'd just like to say that thank you so much for being here. This is part 3 of an ongoing seminar series, and we do have a few more speakers who are going to be coming in next couple of weeks talking about renewables and integration of renewables for India and Africa, and we hope to see you there soon. But Dave, thank you so much for sharing your views on this.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the wonderful questions, and look forward to actually participating in future.
Yeah.
Thank you.